5 seconds to the open. Ready?
Who wants to get this thing started right about now?
Welcome to Follow the Money Weekly with your host, Jerry Robinson.
Welcome.
Not just some guru.
Oh, really?
Your host is an economist and a best-selling author.
What an interesting news item. I'd better write that down.
And just someone who likes to make money and help you to make money. Welcome to Follow the Money Weekly. And here he is, Jerry Robinson.
All right, friends, welcome to this episode of the Follow the Money podcast with Jerry Robinson. Great to have you here along for the ride. You know, America's national debt is now closing in on $40 trillion, and Washington is projected to spend roughly $7.4 trillion this year. Remember now, there's no pandemic, there's no economic depression, there's no declared world war, and yet the federal government is still spending as though the nation is facing some permanent state of emergency. Meanwhile, Social Security continues moving towards a funding crisis. Our healthcare system here in America consumes trillions of dollars while producing disappointing outcomes. Our public schools are struggling. American families are being squeezed financially. And yet Washington still continues to find money for wars of choice, corporate subsidies, foreign commitments, and all kinds of politically connected interests. So the problem is not that America has no money. America has plenty of money. The problem is that our priorities are completely out of whack. The fact is, budgets reveal priorities much more honestly than political speeches do. And when we examine where that money is actually going, that is, when we follow the money, it becomes very clear, abundantly clear, that Washington has forgotten how to distinguish between what is truly necessary and what is merely politically useful. Today's episode is number 515. We're calling it America's Permanent Emergency. We're going to look at what nearly $40 trillion in debt says about our national priorities and what Americans are actually receiving in return for $7.4 trillion in annual spending, and what this growing debt burden could mean for interest rates, the dollar, gold, and your own investment portfolio. Let's get started. All right. So on today's episode, we're talking about America's permanent emergency. I chose that phrase very carefully because when you look at the federal budget today, you would think that the United States was facing some extraordinary national crisis. I mean, really, you would think that the banks had collapsed. You would think that unemployment was at 20%, or maybe the economy had even been shut down. You would think we were fighting for our national survival in another world war. But none of those things are true. There is no pandemic. There's no economic depression. There's no declared world war. And yet the federal government is projected to spend roughly $7.4 trillion this fiscal year. $7.4 trillion in a single year of spending. And as I mentioned, that number is likely to be even higher by the end of the fiscal year. See, Washington expects to collect only around $5.6 trillion in revenue for this fiscal year. That leaves another big deficit of nearly $2 trillion for the year. That deficit, by the way, when we do the math, is equal to about 6% of the entire U.S. economy, which is far above the average deficit of the past 50 years, according to the Congressional Budget Office. And that's what I want you to think about here. In what Washington would probably describe as relatively normal economic conditions, the federal government is still borrowing nearly $2 trillion per year. Again, you would think this is some sort of emergency spending, but instead it's actually just the business model. And that's why I call it America's permanent emergency. See, we're operating with something that looks like a wartime budget, not because America is fighting a declared world war, but because Washington has forgotten what a peacetime budget actually looks like. Every year brings a new emergency, a new crisis, a new threat. There's always a new reason why this particular spending package simply cannot wait, or why this particular industry needs corporate subsidies, or another reason why this particular foreign government needs more weapons. Everything is urgent. Everything is essential. Everything must be funded immediately, and somehow The bill is always sent to the future. Now, America's national debt is rapidly approaching $40 trillion. In fact, the total public debt rose by more than $400 billion between July 1st and July 28th. It's just simply astonishing and, quite frankly, unsustainable. And the debt just keeps climbing. It really should be a scandal, right? That almost everyone in Washington now considers trillion-dollar deficits to be normal. And where, by the way, are all these fiscal hawks that were telling us that we had to cut the deficit and that we had to pay down the national debt? Where are the conservatives who spent years warning us that the national debt was about to destroy the country? Where are the balanced budget Republicans right now? Where are the people who told us that they were going to come into Washington and drain the swamp and eliminate the waste and cut the spending and send the savings back to the American people? They have mostly gone silent. And I want to be honest with you about why. Because for much of Washington, fiscal conservatism has never been a deeply held principle. It's been a campaign slogan. It's something politicians use when the other party is in power. Republicans discover the national debt when Democrats control Washington. Democrats suddenly discover fiscal restraint when someone proposes reducing taxes or spending money on something that they oppose. But once their own side is in power, the rules change. Their tax cuts do not have to be paid for. Their spending priorities are called investments. Their wars are suddenly necessary. Their subsidies are strategic. And their favorite programs are considered untouchable. They always claim that the deficits are just temporary and that their borrowing is always someone else's problem. That is the con. See, Republicans want tax cuts without the spending restraint necessary to make them sustainable, and Democrats want expensive government programs without collecting enough revenue to pay for them. Both parties promise immediate benefits but postpone the sacrifice. And even worse, both parties send the bill to younger Americans, including millions who have not even been born yet. But I want to be very clear in this episode. My primary argument today is not that America has no money. My argument is not that this country is too poor to do anything worthwhile. America has enormous wealth. We have the largest and most sophisticated capital markets on earth, extraordinary technology. We have vast natural resources. We have some of the most innovative businesses on the planet with productive workers. We have world-class universities, incredibly advanced medicine, and an economy that is actually capable of producing wealth on a scale that previous generations could scarcely imagine. So don't let anyone fool you. America has money. The problem is that our priorities are completely out of order. Like I said, Washington can always find money for another war, right? Military interventions, overseas commitments, weapons packages, industry bailouts. There's no end to the money they can find for these things. If there's a tax break written by lobbyists, that's probably going to happen. But when it comes to protecting Social Security or repairing our broken healthcare system or improving education, suddenly everybody in Washington becomes deeply concerned about the cost. Suddenly the question is, how are we going to pay for it? Isn't that interesting? Nobody ever seems to ask that question until the proposed spending might directly improve the lives of ordinary Americans like you and I. Consider Social Security. This is a topic I've been writing about for years. I wrote about it in my book, Bankruptcy of Our Nation, talking about how this had to be dealt with. Congress has known for decades that Social Security faces a long-term financing problem. It's not a big surprise. It's not a black swan. It's not something that just popped up last week. According to the 2026 Social Security Trustees Report, the trust fund that pays retirement and survivor benefits is expected to exhaust its reserves in the fourth quarter of 2032. So if Congress does nothing, then continuing payroll tax income would be enough to cover only about 78% of the scheduled benefits that you're expected to receive at that point. That's according to the Social Security Administration. And in fact, this is also a very interesting thing as we go into the midterm elections here in the United States. This will be the very first election where we will actually be electing senators who will be around in 2032 to see this happen. And what's so amazing is it seems to be on no one's radar. There's not a lot of politicians talking about how they want to go to Washington to fix Social Security and they actually have a solution. There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of speeches, but the priorities betray these politicians. Now, I understand that Social Security is complicated. It's funded largely through payroll taxes, and the accounting behind the trust fund is very confusing. It's often misunderstood. Social Security by itself, by the way, is not responsible for the entire national debt, but none of that changes the central fact. Congress has watched this problem approach for decades and has done almost nothing. Why? Because every single serious solution requires someone to tell voters the truth. Maybe the payroll tax has to change. Maybe the taxable wage cap has to rise. Maybe benefits for higher income retirees have to be adjusted. Maybe other revenue has to be devoted to the program. Or maybe retirement policy in this country needs to be reconsidered in a gradual manner. There are obviously many different possible combinations to solve this problem, but every year that Congress waits, the range of relatively painless solutions becomes narrower and narrower. It's terribly ironic because Washington can always find hundreds of billions of dollars for almost anything it considers urgent today, but it cannot find the political courage to protect a retirement system that working Americans have paid into their entire lives. So it's clearly not a lack of money problem, it's a priority problem. Right? Then we have U.S. healthcare. America spent approximately $5.3 trillion on healthcare in 2024, which works out to around $15,000 for every person in the country. And healthcare consumed about 18% of the entire U.S. economy. And what are we getting for that money? We obviously have brilliant doctors and dedicated nurses, world-class hospitals. We have extraordinary medical technology. Some of the most amazing drugs and treatments have become available in recent years. I'm not criticizing the people who work inside the healthcare system. Many of them are doing heroic work inside of a system that frustrates them just as much as it frustrates patients. But let's not kid ourselves here. The system is broken. It's fragmented and incredibly opaque. It's overloaded with bureaucracy and administration. Prices are hidden from patients and bills are almost impossible to understand. And insurance networks are very confusing. Drug pricing is a complete maze. Rural hospitals are going out of business and the bigger hospitals are consolidating to gain more market power. Many families here in America are delaying necessary treatments because they're afraid of the bill they're going to get and probably not be able to understand, let alone pay. Then you have employers who are struggling with rising premiums for their employees. Workers remain tied to jobs that they may dislike, but they can't risk losing their health coverage. So we have world-class medicine wrapped inside one of the most expensive and bewildering payment systems ever created. Again, this isn't because America doesn't spend enough. We spend more than enough. The question is what that spending is actually doing. What are we accomplishing with it? We don't merely need more healthcare spending. We need more health and transparent pricing. We need competition. We need preventative care to be covered by insurance companies. We need to confront chronic disease and to simplify administration and bureaucracy. What we really need to do is realign the incentives in the healthcare system so that the system rewards healing and long-term health, not simply more billing and more procedures and more complexity. And then there are our public schools here in America. According to the latest national assessment, reading scores declined again in 2024 for both fourth graders and eighth graders. The average reading score for both grades was 5 points below its 2019 level. Now, I'm not blaming teachers. Teachers can't solve every social problem that walks through the classroom door. We got all kinds of family instability issues and screen addiction problems, and many kids aren't attending school the way they should. Maybe they don't have good discipline at home. Obviously, the culture that we grow up in is going to determine what's going to happen to us when we get to the public school. And there are wonderful schools and wonderful educators all across this country, but nationally, the results should greatly concern us. We are leaving young Americans two things right now: lower educational achievement and a larger national debt. And it's not for a lack of money. We spend enormous amounts on education and administration and testing and consultants and programs and curriculum and technology and bureaucracy. Yet millions of students leave school without a basic understanding of reading, writing, and arithmetic, let alone civics or personal finance or taxes. Many young adults can explain the latest social media trend, but no one has ever taught them how a credit card works or how to write a check. They've never been shown how to build an emergency fund. They don't understand why investing early matters and how it could literally change the trajectory of their whole life. They don't understand the national debt, let alone how ongoing government debt eventually affects inflation and taxes and interest rates and their own economic future. No, we have money. We simply don't always spend it on the things that produce wisdom and competence, independence, and long-term human flourishing. And then there's the question of our warfare state, right? The United States obviously has legitimate security needs. Every nation has a responsibility to defend its people. But defending the United States is not the same thing as starting wars of aggression illegally without constitutional approval. It's not the same thing as policing the entire world. And it's not the same thing as financing wars of choice or proxy wars or regime change operations. And these indefinite deployments and foreign interventions that have no clear defined endpoint. But Washington rarely seems to have trouble finding money for war. There's always another threat, another enemy. We need that weapons package. We need that new military base or this other foreign government. We must support them because this conflict is the decisive struggle of our age. And if we don't help them, then everything could go to pot. And because most of that spending is financed through borrowing, the American public is shielded from the immediate costs. Imagine how different foreign policy might look if Congress had to send every American household a separate war tax bill before approving an intervention. Imagine you got a letter in the mail and it said this: your household's share of this military operation is $4,800. Payment is due next month. I suspect that the appetite for wars of choice would decline rather quickly. How about you? Or maybe we could pass an amendment that requires that in order for the Defense Department to wage a war, it must first hold a vote with the public. And every single pro-war voter who votes for the war must also enlist in that war. You see, it's one thing to go send the boys off to war. It's another thing to be given your rifle, put on a helicopter, and dropped in the middle of the jungles. I suspect the pro-war advocates within our communities would suddenly find themselves mum if that were the case. No, as long as someone else is paying for the war and as long as someone else is fighting it, we'll go ahead and do it and blacktop the roads while you're there, huh? You see, all this government borrowing allows political leaders to enjoy the short-term benefits of looking strong and like they know what they're doing without asking today's voters to pay the full cost. The defense contractors get the big fat contracts. The politicians get the good headlines that they were after, and then future generations like your children and your grandchildren, they're going to get the debt. And don't forget about the military families and civilians overseas who bear the human consequences of it all. War doesn't just consume money. It consumes lives and families and the moral credibility of the nation that wages it. So when I say America's priorities are out of order, I am not arguing that government should spend nothing. I am not calling for the elimination of every public program or suggesting that a wealthy and civilized nation should abandon the elderly or the poor or the disabled or the sick or the children. Quite the contrary. I am arguing for better stewardship. We need to spend first on what matters most. We need to honor the promises that we have already made to our veterans and to our retirees and to our children. We need to protect the vulnerable. We need to defend the country without constantly searching for new enemies and using warfare and new wars as a way to create a smokescreen to distract from other current politically inconvenient issues. We need to invest in our children. We need to build productive infrastructure. Our infrastructure in this country is breaking down in many different ways. The roads, the bridges, and so many different facets of infrastructure need help. And we need to demand measurable results. Just like any other business, the United States government should be held to account. We need to audit their programs. We need to demand measurable results. And if they can't produce them, the bums need to be kicked out. We need to end what's not working and reform what is failing. And almost above all, we need to stop pretending that borrowing more money makes the cost disappear. Because borrowing does not eliminate the cost, it transfers the cost, usually to someone younger or someone with less political influence, usually to someone who has not even been born. This present government promised dramatic savings from Doge. Does anybody remember that? There was even discussion of sending Americans Doge dividend checks to the tune of around $5,000. They were going to go and cut all of the waste in government. And once they got in there, they didn't do it. And as far as those dividend checks, you aren't getting them. Those checks never arrived, but the national debt certainly went up by a massive amount. And then we had massive tariffs that the American consumer had to pay over the last few years. When those were slapped down by the Supreme Court as being entirely illegal, the Trump administration was forced to send out refunds, tariff refunds, and those were eventually distributed. They largely flowed back to the companies that had formally paid the duties and possessed the legal documentation to get them. But the families who absorbed higher prices at the grocery store didn't get any kind of direct refund. The corporations had customs records and lawyers, and they had standing, but American households didn't. And that is what distorted priorities look like in practice. Not merely a government that spends too much and too frivolously, but a government that repeatedly serves the people closest to power while sending the cost outward and downward to those who are most vulnerable. After spending $7.4 trillion in this fiscal year, Washington still tells us we don't know what to do about Social Security. They tell us that health care reform is just too difficult. They tell us that schools are a local problem and that infrastructure just has to wait. And families should tighten their belt. But somehow, there's always room for one more emergency, one more foreign intervention, one more corporate subsidy, one more war. America is not running out of money. America is running out of the discipline required to distinguish what is genuinely necessary from what is merely politically useful. And as we stand in awe looking at the $40 trillion national debt that this country has racked up, we realize that it serves as a financial record of decades of misplaced priorities. Every single dollar of debt represents a choice. And every deficit that we have represents decisions that political leaders refuse to pay for honestly. And every single interest payment that is made by the government, which, by the way, is one of the leading costs to the government now, with interest rates elevated and with the debt soaring out of control. And with every interest payment that's made, that represents money that can no longer be used for something productive today. So the central issue is not whether America can afford to spend money. Of course we can. We're spending it like drunken sailors. The issue is whether we possess the wisdom, restraint, honesty, and moral clarity to spend it well. Right now, the answer is increasingly obvious. America is spending as though every single year is an emergency, and yet we are neglecting the emergencies that are already standing directly in front of us. Hey friends, Jerry Robinson here from followthemoney.com. Before we continue with today's podcast, let me just mention something really quickly. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while and you're starting to think more seriously about your own situation, your investments, your retirement plan, and how everything is actually structured, there comes a point where it helps to talk it through with someone. And that's why we created our Follow the Money Advisor Referral Service. We work with a network of trusted financial professionals across the country, and we can connect you with someone who can help you take the next step, whatever that looks like for you. Maybe it's reviewing your current retirement plan, or maybe it's putting a real income strategy in place, or maybe you just have a simple question like getting a life insurance quote. If that sounds helpful, you can learn more at followthemoney.com/advice, or just give us a call at 800-609-5530. No pressure, just a chance to get some clarity around where you are and where you're going.
Welcome back to Follow the Money Weekly. And here's Jerry Robinson.
All right, friends, welcome back to one of the longest running personal finance podcasts on the planet. This is Follow the Money with Jerry Robinson. As you guessed, my name is Jerry Robinson. I'm an economist. author of the book Bankruptcy of Our Nation, investor, founder here at followthemoney.com, where we help people every single day, just like you, learn how to trade, invest, make more income through multiple streams of income, and on and on. Well, we've spent much of today's program talking about America's permanent emergency, right? We have this national debt that's nearing $40 trillion. We've got this federal spending of roughly $7.5 trillion a year. And we have a political system that appears unable or unwilling to bring its promises and its priorities into alignment. But I want to shift gears in this segment too, because obviously just having a bunch of outrage about this is not an investment strategy. We might be mad about it, right? We can look at it and see that it's very frustrating to see what's happening in Washington or maybe even in your own state and local governments. But you can't let outrage be your investment strategy. You can't look at fear and say, well, there's my financial plan, right? In fact, it makes things worse. And the fact that the national debt is approaching, this $40 trillion does not mean that you should sell every investment, empty out your retirement account, and run for the hills, right? Investors have been warned about the national debt for decades. I've been talking about this myself on this broadcast for many years. We've documented it since it was around $6 trillion, and then $7 trillion, then $10 trillion, then $20 trillion. It just keeps growing. But, many of those warnings were valid, but investors who responded by permanently abandoning stocks or businesses or productive cash flowing assets missed one of the greatest periods of wealth creation in history. So the real question is not simply whether the debt is dangerous. We know that. The real question is, what does all this mean for you and your finances? What does it mean for your money? And what should a thoughtful, disciplined investor be doing right now? Well, right now, if you look around the financial markets, let's begin with the bond market. In my opinion, the bond market may eventually impose the discipline that Congress refuses to impose upon itself. The federal government can, of course, vote to spend more money, and it can increase borrowing and raise the debt ceiling like it always does. It can issue more debt securities. But Washington does not completely control the price investors will demand to finance that debt, right? If the Treasury must issue more bonds to pay all of its debt, and buyers begin demanding greater compensation for inflation and the currency risk that goes along with it and all the fiscal uncertainty, then what you're going to see is yields rise. And when long-term Treasury yields rise, the effects spread throughout the economy. That means that mortgage rates will be higher and corporate borrowing will become more expensive. Commercial real estate in particular will become under greater pressure, and consumers will face higher financing costs. And of course, the national debt will become much, much harder to service. The interest bill is going to grow. Higher rates don't merely hurt homeowners or businesses, they also make that federal debt much more expensive to carry. So as that older Treasury debt matures, it must often be refinanced at current market rates. So a government that borrowed cheaply for years is going to suddenly find out that it's going to have to refinance trillions of dollars at much higher yields, which creates a dangerous feedback loop because the more debt that you have, the more it produces interest expenses, right? And the more interest expense produces larger deficits, and then the larger deficits require more borrowing, right? And of course, more borrowing will eventually require still higher yields to attract enough buyers. Of course, Treasury yields are a function of many things, the economy, inflation, and what investors' appetite is. So yields can fall, they can go up, they can go down, but the longer-term fiscal pressure that I'm describing here is very real, and investors should respect what the bond market is telling them. If you look at the 10-year yield or even the 30-year yield, or you look how the Treasury auctions are being received, or even the inflation expectations, right? When you look at all of that, you see that investors are still under the assumption that rates are not coming down right this second. They remain elevated, largely due to uncertainty about the future path of inflation. But now let me say something about those higher interest rates. It's not entirely bad news, right? They can create risk for borrowers, but they can also create opportunities for savers. For many, many years, conservative investors have earned almost nothing on their cash, T-bills, CDs, high-quality bonds. Retirees were pushed further out on the risk spectrum because traditional income investments simply didn't produce enough income. But today, that picture is different. You look at short-term treasuries, they offer some meaningful yields. High-quality bonds may once again deserve a place in a balanced portfolio. I've heard many of our members who are working on bond ladders right now to create some sort of predictable income. One of my favorites is fixed annuities, which can offer even more attractive rates and give you a guaranteed lifetime income. In fact, certain fixed index annuities may provide improved terms because insurers can invest premiums at higher yields. That's what we're seeing in a lot of the life insurance companies now. Higher yields are allowing them to make more money on the money that they have in reserves. So in other words, the same higher rates that create problems for Washington may end up creating opportunities for disciplined savers. And that's where retirement planning really becomes important. We often talk about the 3-bucket strategy that I've talked about before. In fact, we even did a podcast episode on it not too long ago. That first bucket is liquidity, right? Money that you need soon. This is emergency savings, your near-term expenses. These are funds that should not be exposed to major market volatility. The second bucket is that safe growth assets, which is very, very important. This is money that actually gives you contractual guarantees, such as we mentioned, a fixed indexed annuity or something along those lines where you actually have a guarantee on the money. And then you have a third bucket, which is your risk growth bucket, which is we're talking about stocks and ETFs and dividend paying companies and cryptocurrencies and all the other things that just don't come with any kind of guarantees. The more you spend working on that 3-bucket strategy, the more prepared you're going to be. It will also protect you from what's ahead. It's going to really prevent you from being forced to sell a long-term investment at the wrong time simply because you weren't liquid. Now, let's also talk about the US dollar, because whenever the national debt, hits 40 trillion, moves on to 50 trillion, we're going to continue seeing it rise, I'm sure. You'll hear predictions that the dollar is about to collapse, right? That's very common. Could the dollar face serious long-term pressure? Absolutely. But I would be cautious about expecting one dramatic overnight collapse. I've been teaching against that now for probably almost 2 decades now. It's hard to believe. We believe that the dollar is going to remain under pressure over time, but not in some sort of dramatic collapse. The more likely risk will be this gradual erosion that we've been seeing over the last several decades. A little more inflation, right? A little less purchasing power. We'll have periods where we have negative real interest rates, and we'll have higher taxes. And they'll eventually develop policies that will be designed to reduce the real burden of government debt over time. And that's how sovereign debt problems usually affect ordinary people like you and me. Not through some sort of dramatic announcement that the government has defaulted, but through a currency that just continually purchases less, right? Or benefits that fail to keep pace with living costs, or taxes that are just always creeping a little higher. And this is one of the primary reasons why I have been teaching investors for so long that they need to own productive, high-quality assets. The reason why: strong businesses can raise prices. They can innovate, which allows them to grow earnings and pay dividends. They can repurchase shares. They can adapt to changing economic conditions. Of course, not every stock is a good investment. You have to look at the valuation. How much debt do they have? Do they have cash flow? How is their management? On and on and on. But my greater point here is that the answer to irresponsible government borrowing is not necessarily to sell all of your high-quality assets and productive assets and go sit permanently in cash. Cash is great. It's nice to have some cash. Liquidity is important, but cash has that purchasing power risk. Now, this is also where gold can play a role. So, I'm a long-term holder of gold. I view it as portfolio insurance. I do not view gold as a substitute for stocks or for other productive assets. It doesn't generate earnings. It doesn't pay a dividend. It doesn't innovate. But gold has served for centuries as a form of monetary insurance. So I don't own gold because I think the world is going to end tomorrow. I own it because governments through history have usually chosen to weaken their currency before meaningfully reducing their spending promises. It usually goes in that order. In fact, I just alerted our members just a few weeks ago that I was resuming purchases of gold in this third quarter of 2026. I had taken a break as gold had hit, an all-time high. It was obviously overbought. We waited for it to come back down where it is now, around 4,000 or so, and we began adding more to our long-term holdings. We keep it at a fairly small allocation, but that allocation, again, provides that portfolio insurance for us. So we have, money in real estate. We have money in equities. We have money in Bitcoin. We have money in physical gold bullion, right? We have money in businesses. So what we want to do really is we want to diversify. And this really just applies to your whole portfolio. Know what you own, know why you own it, know how much risk you're taking. Now, should the national debt nearing $40 trillion, should that change how you invest? Yes, but probably not in the way that some people imagine, right? It should encourage you to diversify is what it should do. It should make you more cautious about taking on excessive leverage, and it should cause you to pay attention to inflation and interest rates, and it also to remind you not to depend entirely upon government promises. I'm sure most of our audience already knows that by now. But it should also reinforce the importance of owning a good mixture of high-quality assets that will respond perhaps differently under different economic conditions. So that would probably include some high-quality stocks. ETFs are great. Index funds can be a great way to counter the ravaging effects of inflation on your finances. I like dividend growers as well. We've talked about that. In fact, we've been we just did a podcast episode on dividend growth. I encourage you to check that out if you haven't listened to it. Hard assets like gold and silver, and obviously real estate, and also things such as cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, and obviously guarantees. Anything with contractual guarantees should be considered to be useful in this current age where there is so much risk and so little in the way of guarantees. But the primary way to think about this is to avoid the all or nothing mindset. Don't convince yourself that you must be either fully invested or entirely out of investing. Don't assume that one economic headline has to determine your entire portfolio, right? Don't allow political frustrations to dictate the portfolio decisions that you make with your money. I am very concerned about Washington, but I still own American businesses, right? I know that the dollar is going to face long-term pressure, but I still hold enough cash for short-term needs. I own physical gold, but I don't necessarily believe that civilization is about to entirely collapse. Look, the truth is you cannot control Washington's balance sheet, but you can control yours, right? You can eliminate high-interest consumer debt. You can build an emergency fund. You can avoid living beyond your means. You can diversify your income and create multiple streams of income. You can contribute consistently to your retirement accounts. You can review your assets on a regular basis and make sure you're properly diversified. And you can prepare for the possibility of higher taxes in the future by making smart moves today. You can also build a retirement plan that doesn't depend entirely on Social Security arriving exactly as Washington promises. In other words, the national debt is a reason to prepare. It's not a reason to panic. My job and your job is not to predict every single turn and twist of the financial markets. Our job is to build a financial life that can endure more than one possible future. Nobody knows what's coming. We have some pretty good inklings as to where things are heading, but nobody really knows the future. So in that environment, my advice is to obviously maintain an adequate amount of liquidity in that bucket number one, and then, of course, to keep your debt manageable and to own high-quality assets, whether that be real estate or whether it be high-quality stocks or ETFs. I also strongly encourage you to diversify your sources of income. That's something we've been teaching here for many years, the importance of creating multiple streams of income. Quite frankly, good investing is quite boring. The key is to stay disciplined. And remember that the goal of all of this is to protect your purchasing power over time. Well, coming up in segment 3, I'm going to share a few final thoughts and a word of encouragement as we close out today's program. You're listening to Follow the Money with Jerry Robinson. We'll be right back. All right, friends, welcome back to the final moments of today's broadcast. Before we go, I want to leave you with this. It's so easy to look at Washington and see the massive debt and the waste and the misplaced priorities and to just feel entirely powerless. But you, my friend, are not powerless. You don't control the federal budget. You may not control interest rates or what Congress funds next, but you still control many of the decisions that will shape your own future. You can live below your means. You can reduce debt or save consistently. You can invest for the long term. You can build more than one source of income. You can prepare for retirement without assuming someone else is going to solve everything for you. And you can teach the next generation lessons about money that Washington itself seems unwilling to learn. You see, we're in very uncertain times right now. And in uncertain times, discipline, clear thinking, and patience, and perhaps even most importantly, peace, become incredibly valuable. Do not let the size of the national debt convince you that your own choices and your own finances no longer matter, because they do. Small, wise decisions made consistently over time can change the direction of a family. They can create stability. They can create options for you in the future. And they can also lead to great amounts of generosity in the future that you can share with others. Small, wise decisions can literally change your family tree. And they can create the kind of freedom to live now according to your values rather than according to the latest crisis. So while I encourage you to stay informed, don't live consumed by the headlines. Prepare, but don't panic. Take responsibility for what is within your control, but refuse to surrender your peace over what's not in your control. The future may be uncertain, but uncertainty has always been a part of investing and business and life. You don't need perfect foresight for the next decade. You just need wisdom for the next step. And that is just something to think about. Well, friends, I'm Jerry Robinson, thanking you for joining me today on Follow the Money. And remember, when you want the truth about the global economy, just follow the money. Have a safe and prosperous week, and I'll see you right back here next time. Until then, God bless.
Information contained on the Follow the Money podcast is strictly for informational and educational purposes. It should not be construed as specific investment advice. The views and opinions of our guests and sponsors, including Tom Cloud, are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of FTMDaily.com or Robinson Media Group, LLC. Jerry Robinson does hold an insurance license and at times may offer consulting on life insurance and fixed retirement income products. Follow-up, individualized responses to email or phone requests that involve the rendering of personalized investment advice for compensation will not be made absent compliance with state investment advisor registration requirements or an applicable exemption or exclusion and applicable insurance regulations. Past performance is not indicative of future results. You should be aware of the real risk of loss in following any strategy or investment discussion on the podcast. Remember, never do your financial planning through podcast or radio. It's your money. Be wise. Do your due diligence and always consult a trusted financial professional before making any financial decisions.